This video was made possible by the generous support of my patrons. If you would like to join them in helping grow this channel, you can do so at the links in the description below. In Engels' 1872 text, titled The Housing Question, he addresses the revolutionary tasks of the proletariat, particularly regarding the state's role in societal issues like housing. He critiqued the current system where housing problems are never truly resolved, and argued that a socialist revolution is necessary for the expropriation and redistribution of housing. He says that, as soon as the proletariat has won political power, such a measure prompted by concern for the common good will be just as easy to carry out as are other expropriations and billetings by the present-day state. Engels distinguishes the proletarian state role from the old state apparatus. While both may order actions like expropriation, the existing bureaucracy aligned with bourgeois interests would be incapable of executing the proletarian state directives. He contrasts this approach with Proudhon, explaining that while individual ownership is central to Proudhon's theory, Marxism envisions collective ownership of property, which would not be granted to individuals without compensation, particularly during the transitional period. Marx says that the actual seizure of all the instruments of labor by the working people, therefore, does not at all preclude the retention of rent relations. Engels also adds that while the proletarian state may allow for rent during the transition, it ultimately aims to wither away, eliminating the need for such a state in the future. This process involves the dissolution of class distinctions, with the state disappearing once class society has been abolished. In 1873, Marx and Engels criticized anarchists like Proudhon for rejecting the need for a revolutionary state, arguing that a workers' dictatorship in replacing the bourgeois state would require the establishment of a new state that would take on a revolutionary and transient form. Marx explained that if the political struggle of the working class assumes revolutionary form, and if the workers set up their revolutionary dictatorship in place of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, they commit the terrible crime of violating principles, for in order to satisfy their wretched, vulgar, everyday needs, and to crush the resistance of the bourgeoisie, they give the state a revolutionary and transient form, instead of laying down their arms and abolishing the state. Marx therefore opposed the idea that workers should abandon the use of arms and organized violence, which were necessary to crush bourgeois resistance, emphasizing that while the state would eventually wither away after the abolition of classes, a temporary use of state power was essential for the revolution. Engels similarly criticized anti-authoritarians, arguing that authority is necessary for the functioning of a complex social system, including factories and railways. He ridiculed the anarchist refusal to recognize the need for authority in revolution, writing that, "A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is an act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon, all of which are authoritarian means." He therefore condemned the anarchist call to abolish authority immediately, claiming that it would lead to confusion or betrayal of the proletariat cause. Engels stressed that all socialists agree that the state will eventually disappear after the revolution, but the anarchists' failure to recognize the role of authority and power to carry out the revolution made their position non-revolutionary. He similarly criticized the Social Democrats for evading the concrete tasks of revolution as well, especially regarding the use of state power, and called for a more serious, concrete study of the proletariat's role in the revolution by drawing lessons from past experiences like the Paris Commune. In a letter to Babel dated March 18th to 28th, 1875, Engels criticized the draft of the Gotha program, particularly its concept of the free people's state. He argued that the term free state was contradictory because under the proletariat the state would become merely a transitional institution used by the working class to suppress the bourgeoisie and maintain its rule. As he wrote, "The people's state has been thrown in our faces by the anarchists to the point of disgust. Although already Marx's book against Proudhon and later the Communist Manifesto say plainly that with the introduction of the socialist order of society, the state dissolves itself and disappears." Engels argued that once the proletariat is no longer needed to use the state to hold down its adversaries, it would wither away. He also argued that the Paris Commune represented such a state, because it had replaced the repressive apparatus of the bourgeois state with direct popular control, where the people were in charge, rather than a separate coercive force. But Engels also criticized the idea of a people's state as an absurdity that misrepresented socialism. According to Engels, the state could not be freed or transformed in such a way. Rather, it would dissolve once its coercive function was no longer necessary. Engels even suggested that the term state should be replaced with community or Gemeinwesen, a concept more in line with socialism's overall goals. But despite Engels' critique, opportunist interpretations of the state continued to dominate Marxism, even after his letter to Babel was published. Babel initially agreed with Engels' critique, but in his pamphlet titled Our Aims, he contradicted Engels by suggesting that the state should be transformed into a people's state. Engels maintained that such a concept reflects the persistence of incorrect, opportunist ideas within the German social democratic movement, which, despite its revolutionary interpretations, continued to promote reformist views. Lenin argues that these distortions have been allowed to persist for so long because opportunists have sidelined certain writings, such as Engels' letter to Babel. Engels' critique of the Erfurt program highlights key aspects of his revolutionary theory as well. He criticizes the program's failure to address the need for a republic in Germany, emphasizing that the existing constitutional framework only masked the absolutism of the government. Engels argued that in countries like Germany, where the government holds such great power, advocating for a peaceful path to socialism was absurd. In his own words, "In Germany, where the government is almost omnipotent and the Reichstag and all other representative bodies have no real power, to advocate for such a thing in Germany, where moreover there is no need to do so, means removing the fig leaf of absolutism and becoming oneself a screen for its nakedness." Engels also notes a shift from joint stock companies to trusts, which monopolize industries and plan production. While trusts may appear to mitigate capitalism's tendency towards planlessness, they do not eliminate capitalism itself. He critiques the bourgeois reformist claim that monopoly capitalism could be considered state socialism, reaffirming that these developments are part of capitalism in a new stage, not a move towards socialism. Engels instead advocated for a united, centralized republic over a federal one, seeing federalism as a hindrance to progress. He pointed to the fragmentation of Germany into petty states to support his view for a united republic, which would be more beneficial for proletarian revolution. He drew comparisons with the Federal Republic of Switzerland and the centralized French Republic of the late 18th century, arguing that centralization offered more freedom with a greater focus on voluntary cooperation from different regions and communes. In his preface to the third edition of The Civil War in France, Engels offers a profound analysis of the Paris Commune and its lessons for the proletariat. He critiques the superstitious belief in the state, prevalent in Germany, and contrasts this with France, where the working class faced continuous opposition from the bourgeoisie, which sought to disarm them after every revolution. As Engels writes, "It was precisely the oppressing power of the centralized government, army, political parties, bureaucracy, which Napoleon had created in 1798, and which every new government had since then taken over as a welcome instrument and used against its opponents. It was this power which was to fall everywhere, just as it had fallen in Paris." He argues that the state, whether monarchy or democratic republic, remained a tool of class oppression, and that true working class power requires dismantling the old state apparatus and replacing it with a new, genuinely democratic form. The Commune's approach to governance involved measures such as election-based appointments, officials subject to recall, and equal wages for all public servants, which aimed to prevent careerism and place hunting. Engels notes that these reforms, while not fully socialist, laid the groundwork for a transformation of state functions into simple operations of control and accounting, bringing society closer to socialism. However, he stressed that while full democracy is impossible under capitalism, under socialism, democracy will evolve and eventually wither away. He warns against replacing a monarchy with a democratic republic without first addressing the fundamental issue of class oppression. He also critiques the German Social Democrats for their opportunism, particularly their misguided view on religion as a private matter, stressing that overcoming the state will require a new generation, reared in free social conditions, to discard religion entirely. In his 1894 preface to the edition of his articles in 1870, Engels reflected on the term social democrat, which he considered scientifically incorrect. He and Marx used the term communist instead, as they saw the term social democrat being used by groups like the Proudhonists and the Lassalleans, whose views did not align with Marx and Engels' communist aims. As Engels wrote, "Today things are different, and the word social democrat may perhaps pass muster, inexact though it is for a party whose economic program is not merely socialist in general, but downright communist, and whose ultimate political aim is to overcome the whole state, and consequently democracy as well." While democracy is typically understood as the subordination of the minority by the majority, under bourgeois democracy the minority subordinates the majority. Engels argued that this represents a form of organized violence, where one class or group exercises control over all others. He therefore contended that in striving for socialism, the ultimate goal is to reach communism, where violence and subordination of one class by another would no longer be necessary, as people would act in harmony without the need for coercion. Engels ultimately suggested that this great transformation would require a new generation, raised in a society based on free social conditions, in order to discard the remnants of the state. However, he also concluded by noting that the economic basis for the withering away of the state would need to be examined further and according to practical experience. At first glance, Marx and Engels' views on the state might seem contradictory. On the one hand, Engels suggested to Bebel that the word state be removed from political programs and replaced with community, even asserting that the Commune was no longer a state in the true sense. But on the other hand, Marx referred to a future state in communist society, which may imply that he recognized the need for a state even under communism. However, this difference is not fundamental. Upon closer inspection, we can see that both Marx and Engels shared identical views on the state eventually withering away, and that Marx's mention of a future state referred to the state in a process of disappearing. The apparent discrepancy arises from the different contexts and goals of their writings. Engels aimed to criticize the prevailing conceptions about the state and its eventual withering away with the long-term success of socialism, while Marx was concerned with the broader development of communist society and an earlier moment in the transitional period where the state still exists. Marx explained that between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx therefore dismissed the confusion in the Gotha program about the relationship between the state and society, arguing that present-day society refers to capitalist society, whereas the state in communist society would be based on real democracy and scientific data. The key question was which social functions would remain in the current state in a post-capitalist society, and which ones were to be discarded. It is an unmistakable fact that Marx pointed to a transition phase from capitalism to communism, but utopians and opportunists alike have either dismissed, ignored, or feared this conclusion, and have therefore contributed to distorting it. Marx explained that the transition from capitalism to communism requires a political transition period, where the state will become a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Previously, the question of proletarian emancipation focused on overthrowing the bourgeoisie and winning political power. But Marx later rephrased this process as a necessary stage that involves a political transition in which the state takes the form of a revolutionary dictatorship. Regarding democracy, Lenin argued that capitalism creates a democracy for the rich, where political participation is limited and restricted by capitalist exploitation. Despite formal democratic structures, the working class is often excluded from full participation in political life. In countries like Germany, where constitutional legality has persisted for decades, only 1 million out of 15 million wage workers are politically active. Lenin argues that this mass exclusion is reinforced by various mechanisms in capitalist democracy, such as property requirements and limits on suffrage. He says that Marx grasped the essence of capitalist democracy splendidly when, in analyzing the experience of the Commune, he said that the oppressed are allowed once every few years to decide which particular representatives of the oppressing class shall represent and repress them in parliament. Marx emphasized that the transition to communism would not be a smooth progression of democracy, but would require the dictatorship of the proletariat to suppress the capitalist exploiters. This dictatorship, while expanding democracy for the majority, would also involve limiting the freedoms of the capitalist class to prevent resistance. In contrast to the Social Democrats, who were seeking state power to advance working class freedom, Marx and Engels maintained that the proletariat did not need the state for freedom, but to suppress its exploiters. In Engels' words, the proletariat needs the state not in the interests of freedom, but in order to hold down its adversaries, and as soon as it becomes possible to speak of freedom, the state as such ceases to exist. According to Engels, then, in communist society, when class distinctions and capitalist exploiters are abolished, the state will finally wither away, and there will no longer be a need for suppression. True freedom and democracy can only emerge once exploitation and oppression are eliminated. Marx argued that the state would gradually disappear, as the social conditions that give rise to its necessity also disappear. As Marx concluded, only in communist society, when the resistance of the capitalists have disappeared, when there are no classes, only then the state ceases to exist, and it becomes possible to speak of freedom. In the Critique of the Gotha program, Marx criticizes Lassalle's notion that under socialism, workers would receive the full product of their labor. Marx argues that this view is unrealistic, as socialist society would still need to allocate funds for the expansion of production, the replacement of worn-out machinery, and administrative expenses like schools and hospitals. Marx provides a concrete analysis of how socialism would function, emphasizing that the transition from capitalism to communism involves a society still marked by the remnants of the old capitalist system. He describes the early stage of communism as the first or lower phase, where the means of production are no longer privately owned, but belong to society as a whole. According to the Gotha program, at this stage the workers are entitled to the full product of their labor, and according to Lassalle, this is how socialism will create equality. But Marx critiques the notion that this represents either justice or equality. He explains that the principle of equal right under socialism still reflects the language of bourgeois law, which guarantees inequality. Society under bourgeois law can never fully address the real inequalities between individuals, such as differences in strength, family obligations, or needs. Thus, while socialism eliminates the exploitation inherent in capitalism by ensuring that the means of production are collectively owned, it does not immediately resolve all inequalities in wealth or consumption. As Marx argued, with an equal performance of labor and hence an equal share in the social consumption fund, one will in fact receive more than another, one will be richer than another, and so on. The first phase of communism will still distribute goods according to labor performed, which Marx considers a temporary measure as it is shaped by the remnants of capitalist distribution practices. True equality will only emerge in the higher phase of communism, when society evolves beyond these limitations. Marx outlines the process of transition from the first phase of communism to its higher, more advanced phase by envisioning a society where the division between mental and physical labor has been eliminated. He sees a future society where labor is no longer merely a means of survival, but life's prime want, where the productive forces have expanded significantly due to the development of individuals. In this advanced phase, people will contribute to society according to their abilities and receive according to their needs, fully realizing the communist ideal. This shift marks the complete dissolution of the state, as society will no longer require the apparatus of a state to enforce laws or distribute resources. He stresses that this higher phase of communism cannot be introduced overnight, but will evolve gradually over time as society's productive forces develop and individuals become accustomed to working freely for the collective good. This state, as we understand it under capitalism, will be unnecessary when people are able to voluntarily work according to their ability and society can distribute goods without the need for regulation. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and with it also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a livelihood, but life's prime want, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois law be left behind in its entirety. He criticizes bourgeois ideologists that dismiss communism as a utopian fantasy, arguing that socialists do not promise an immediate or unrealistic transformation, but in reality, communists merely advocate for the expropriation of capitalists and the establishment of workers' control over production. The role of the state is to be a temporary instrument for this transition, while remnants of bourgeois law and governance still exist. However, as the democratic structures of workers' control grow, and bourgeois law is slowly left behind, these elements themselves will gradually be replaced. Plekhanov's pamphlet Anarchism and Socialism, written in 1894, addresses the relationship between anarchists and socialists, but fails to engage with the most critical issue: the role of the state in revolution. The pamphlet is divided into two parts. One offers valuable historical and literary analysis of thinkers like Stirner and Proudhon, while the other takes a Philistine stance, reducing anarchism to mere banditry. This reflects Plekhanov's broader political stance during the 1905 to 1917 period, where he aligned more with bourgeois politics than revolutionary socialism. Lenin says that Plekhanov contrived completely to evade the most urgent, burning, and most politically essential issue in the struggle against anarchism, namely, the relation of the revolution to the state, and the question of the state in general. Marx and Engels, by contrast, in their struggles with anarchism, rigorously addressed the question of the state. In his 1891 preface to Marx's Critique of the Gotha program, Engels highlighted their ongoing battle against Bakunin and anarchists who had misrepresented the Paris Commune. Anarchism, they argued, failed to provide concrete solutions to political questions such as whether the existing state machine must be dismantled and replaced, and what should replace it. As Engels wrote, "We were at that time, hardly 2 years after the Hague Congress of the First International, engaged in the most violent struggle against Bakunin and his anarchists." Plekhanov's failure to confront these questions, instead avoiding them, led him into opportunism, as ignoring these fundamental issues facilitated the growth of opportunistic politics. For Marxists, engaging with the state question was vital, and Plekhanov's failure to do so undermined his critique of anarchism. Lenin emphasizes that to speak of anarchism and socialism while completely evading the question of the state and disregarding the whole development of Marxism before and after the Commune meant inevitably slipping into opportunism. Kautsky's work had significant impact in Russia, with many of his writings being translated into Russian, often more than his native Germany. This was particularly important in the early 20th century, when Russian workers, especially in 1905, eagerly sought out his works to bolster the revolutionary movement. Kautsky's popularity in Russia was the result of his contributions to the popularization of Marxism and his early opposition to opportunists like Bernstein, though his later political evolution would become problematic, particularly regarding the key issue of the state in revolution. In Kautsky's earlier work, particularly his critique of Bernstein's premises of socialism, he fails to address the central distortion of Marxism made by Bernstein on the question of the state. Bernstein misrepresents Marx's view on the state, suggesting that Marx simply warned against excessive revolutionary zeal when seizing state power. However, Marx's true position, as clarified by Engels, was that the working class must not simply seize the state machinery, but must smash it entirely. Kautsky, in his response to Bernstein, avoids correcting this misrepresentation. Instead of addressing the core issue of how Marx saw the task of revolution as smashing the state, Kautsky takes a middle road, which effectively softens the revolutionary message, undermining his opposition to opportunism. Lenin highlights this failure by noting that Kautsky refrained from analyzing the utter distortion of Marxism by opportunism on this point. He cited the above-quoted passage from Engels' preface to Marx's Civil War and said that according to Marx, the working class cannot simply take over the ready-made state machinery, but that, generally speaking, it can never take it over, and that was all. In his later work, The Social Revolution, Kautsky continues to avoid directly confronting the question of the state. When he discusses the proletarian revolution and the need for the working class to win state power, he does not engage with the revolutionary lessons of the Paris Commune, particularly regarding the need for the replacement of the bourgeois state with a new form of proletarian democracy. Instead, he offers vague generalities about the social revolution, avoiding concrete discussions of how the state would be transformed or replaced. This avoidance of a critical aspect of Marxist theory, how the state must be dismantled and transformed in a socialist revolution, signals a significant shift in Kautsky's politics towards opportunism. Kautsky's thoughts go no further than a government willing to meet the proletariat halfway, a step backward to Philistinism compared with 1847 when the Communist Manifesto proclaimed the organization of the proletariat as the ruling class. In his later work, The Road to Power, written in 1909, Kautsky acknowledges the advent of a revolutionary era and the exacerbation of class antagonisms, particularly with the rise of imperialism. But despite recognizing the approaching World War and the revolutionary potential it carries, Kautsky again avoids addressing the crucial issue of the state in revolution. His continued evasion of the question, even as he spoke about the need for a proletarian revolution, shows a marked departure from Marx's original revolutionary goals. By not confronting the tasks of smashing the state, Kautsky's works increasingly align with the opportunist positions, leading to his eventual support for social chauvinism during the 1914-1915 crisis, where he failed to take a revolutionary stance during the imperialist war. Kautsky's argument against Pannekoek, and particularly the former's wonderful point that we cannot do without officials, even in our party and trade union organizations, is merely a repetition of Bernstein's old argument against Marxism in general. Pannekoek, part of the left radical trend alongside figures like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Radek, strongly opposed Kautsky's revisionist approach to revolution. He critiqued Kautsky for adopting what he described as a passive radicalism position, characterized by an inactive expectancy of change, which, according to Pannekoek, failed to address the revolutionary task of dismantling the existing state apparatus. In his article, Mass Action and Revolution, Pannekoek argued that the proletariat struggle was not just to seize state power, but to destroy it completely. The aim of the proletarian revolution for Pannekoek was to overthrow the state's instruments of power and replace them with a new system governed by the armed workers, a system distinct from the old state machinery. As Pannekoek wrote, the struggle of the proletariat is not merely a struggle against the bourgeoisie for state power, but a struggle against state power. The content of this proletarian revolution is the destruction and dissolution of the instruments of power of the state with the aid of the instruments of power of the proletariat. Kautsky, in contrast, defended the traditional Marxist position of seizing state power through the existing state apparatus, arguing that it was unnecessary to destroy the state entirely. He proposed that socialists should work to win a majority in parliament and gradually shift the balance of power within the state. Pannekoek criticized this approach, accusing Kautsky of abandoning the Marxist principle of smashing the state apparatus and replacing it with a new revolutionary form. Kautsky's belief in winning power through parliament and maintaining existing state structures such as ministries and bureaucracies stood in direct opposition to Marxist theory, which called for a complete dissolution of these structures after the revolution. For Pannekoek, the distinction between Marxism and anarchism lay in the understanding of the state. While anarchists wanted to abolish the state immediately, Marxists recognized that the state could only wither away after classes had been abolished through socialism, which could not be achieved by simply taking over the existing state apparatus. Marx, as Pannekoek pointed out, emphasized that the proletariat must not merely take over the state power, but destroy the old state machinery, its bureaucracy, police, and army, and replace it with a new form of governance such as the Paris Commune, based on the organization of armed workers. But Kautsky downplayed this necessity and presented the transition to socialism as a gradual process within the confines of the existing state structure, effectively abandoning the revolutionary principles of Marxism. As Lenin says, Kautsky abandons Marxism for the opportunist camp, for this destruction of the state machine, which is utterly unacceptable to the opportunists, completely disappears from his argument. Pannekoek's critique was rooted in Marx's teachings, particularly the lessons of the Paris Commune, which demonstrated that the proletariat must not only seize, but also smash the old state apparatus. He rejected Kautsky's reliance on bureaucratic ministries and elected officials as a means of governance, arguing that such positions only serve to preserve the bourgeois state. Instead, Pannekoek supported the creation of new forms of governance based on workers' councils, Soviets, or similar revolutionary bodies, which would replace the old bureaucratic structures with democratic, direct forms of worker power. Lenin underscores this point by arguing that in a socialist society, the sort of parliament consisting of workers' deputies will of course establish the working regulations and supervise the management of the apparatus, but this apparatus will not be bureaucratic. Kautsky's defense of parliamentary methods and his focus on working within the existing state apparatus was, according to Pannekoek, a form of opportunism that ignored the fundamental necessity of revolution, destroying the old state machine. This strategy, Pannekoek argued, would only lead to the consolidation of bourgeois power and would prevent the transformation of society into a socialist order. Ultimately, Pannekoek viewed Kautsky's position as a betrayal of the Marxist revolution, advocating for gradual reform rather than a complete rupture with the old state. This represented a broader division within the socialist movement, with Pannekoek and his allies aligning with Marx's revolutionary principles, and Kautsky and his followers embracing a more moderate, opportunistic path that preserved existing state structures and delayed the true revolution. This division would have significant implications, especially as imperialist states, fueled by militarism and competitive capitalism, waged wars that devastated millions, highlighting the urgency of breaking with the old state forms and establishing revolutionary proletarian power. As Lenin concludes, "We, however, shall break with the opportunists, and the entire class-conscious proletariat will be with us in the fight, not to shift the balance of forces, but to overthrow the bourgeoisie, to destroy bourgeois parliamentarism, for a democratic republic, after the type of Commune, or a republic of Soviets workers and soldiers' deputies, for the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat."